My name is Renee Harmon, and I was 33 years old the weekend my mother-in-law put my infant son on a grown adult's bed and dragged his crib to the trash. My husband was deployed overseas. I was at weekend drill, 2 hours outside of cell range, doing the work the United States Army pays me to do. When I turned back onto our street that afternoon, the first thing I saw was our green garbage bin sitting at the curb with 4 white crib slats jutting out of it like broken ribs. My son's crib? In the trash. My mother-in-law was standing in the doorway with primer on her hands and a satisfied look on her face. And she said the words I will carry with me for the rest of my life. What she had not planned for, what not one of them had stopped to consider, was who would knock on that door 3 hours later, and what that visitor would set in motion before the day was done. Welcome to her side of the story for every woman who held it together. Alone, this is where we sit with the quiet ones. The stories about women who don't shout back, who don't unravel, who don't need anyone riding in to rescue them. Women who simply prepared, documented, and trusted the truth to do its own work. If you've ever been the one everybody underestimated, you belong here. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Let me take you back to the version of me who still believed that being careful was enough. I enlisted at 18 because the alternative was a small town that had already started forgetting I existed. 12 years later, I had sergeant's stripes on my sleeve, an unblemished record, and a baby boy named Marcus, who was 10 weeks old and smelled like warm milk and fabric softener. My husband, Kevin, was 3 months into a deployment, so most nights it was just Marcus and me, and that particular kind of exhaustion that comes from doing everything right and still bracing for the moment. It won't be. My own mother had passed 2 years before. The last thing she ever made with her hands was a knitted blanket, soft as morning, the color of wheat fields in late summer. I kept it folded over the side of Marcus's crib, so a piece of her would always be close to him. People outside this life assume that being a soldier and a single parent is about toughness. It isn't. It's about systems. I had a schedule for every feeding, a printed sheet for the sitter, a laminated list inside the kitchen cabinet for anyone who ever needed to step in. I trusted paper more than I trusted promises, because paper doesn't change its story when things get inconvenient. That weekend, I had a plan for every single hour of drill. I knew who had Marcus, when he ate, where his pediatrician practiced, what to do in any foreseeable scenario. I had thought of everything. What I had not thought of was Margaret. Margaret was Kevin's mother, and she had made up her mind about me before I ever opened my mouth at our wedding reception. She told Kevin's aunt I looked capable, and said it the way a person says something when it's the best they can manage. She had a line she repeated whenever Marcus came up, delivered soft as a lullaby and sharp as a blade. A baby needs roots, not a rucksack. For a long time I told myself it was snobbery. It wasn't, and I won't pretend it was, because the truth underneath it is sadder than that. Kevin's father had been military too, gone more years than he was present, and then one day gone for good. Margaret had raised Kevin alone in a house that carried the smell of resentment through every season. So when she looked at me, she didn't see her son's wife. She saw the uniform that had taken her husband, walking around now with her grandson on its hip. I understood that. I genuinely did. But understanding why someone is cruel is not the same as agreeing to be the surface they aim it at. The week of that drill, Margaret called Kevin's sister, and the two of them decided I needed support. She texted me all warmth and exclamation marks, saying she would love to come stay a few days and spend some real time with the baby. I should have felt grateful. Instead, the back of my neck went cold, the way it does on a range when something is wrong and you haven't located it yet. I told her my arrangements were already in place. She told me family always finds a way. I didn't sleep well that night. I couldn't have told you exactly why. Here is something most civilians don't know about military life with children. If you are a soldier with a dependent child and no spouse present, you are legally required to have a family care plan on file. Not suggested, not encouraged, required. That plan names, specifically, who will care for your child when duty calls you away. The named caregiver must be vetted, approved, and documented in writing by plan named Greta, the wife of a soldier in my unit. a woman I would have trusted with my own life, who had helped me through the first weeks of Marcus's life while Kevin was gone. Greta had a key to my house, the pediatrician's contact information, and her own copy of every list I kept. Margaret was not on that plan. She had never been on that plan, because a care plan is a promise you cannot take back when emotions run high, and I did not trust her promises where my son was involved. I had also enrolled us in a new parent support program, the kind that sends a nurse to your home for wellness visits. Completely voluntary, completely free, and one of the most quietly useful things I've ever signed up for. My nurse was a woman named Miss Vega, and she had a scheduled visit on the calendar for that very Saturday afternoon. My binder had all of it tabbed and dated on the kitchen counter. My unit teased me about it. 12 years in, and I still kept a binder. But I have always trusted paper more than promises. The Friday before drill, Margaret texted again. Just going to pop by and check on the baby. 3 dots. Then a little heart emoji. My stomach turned over. I texted Greta immediately, as plainly as I could put it. Do not leave him with anyone but me. Anyone. She sent back a thumbs up. I locked my phone, told myself I was being dramatic, and went to pack my gear. I was being a lot of things that weekend. Dramatic was not one of them. Saturday came gray and early. The reserve center was about 40 minutes out past the grain elevator, and the long, flat stretch of highway where every radio station drops out at once. Drill weekends are not optional, and they are not flexible. And we had a field exercise on the schedule, which meant phones locked in a metal cabinet from roughly 9:30 to 11:30. No signal, no exceptions, no way in or out. I had planned around all of it. Before I left, I stood in the nursery with Marcus on my shoulder, swaying the way you do without deciding to. The room was small and plain and entirely his, the crib against the wall, my mother's wheat-colored blanket folded over the rail, the little lamp that hummed when it was on. I pressed my face into the warm spot behind his ear and breathed him in. Milk, and that blanket, and the particular sweetness of a baby who has no idea the world is anything other than safe. Greta arrived at 8 sharp. I went through the list out loud even though she knew every item cold. I kissed Marcus's forehead, handed him a cross, and walked to my truck while my chest did the thing it always does. That tight pull, like a seatbelt across the heart. I told myself the hard part was the leaving. I was wrong about which part of that day was going to be hard. At 9:30, I locked my phone in the cabinet with the others. The lid clicked shut. For 2 hours, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I had committed to do. And for those 2 hours, I had absolutely no idea. I put the rest of it together afterward, from Greta, and from a few people honest enough to tell me what they had seen. Around 10 that morning, a car pulled into my driveway. Margaret and Kevin's sister, Denise, who lived 20 minutes across town, and had appointed herself the family's designated responsible adult. The way some people confuse control with love. They knocked, and when Greta opened the door with Marcus on her hip, Margaret walked in like she had the deed in her pocket. We're family, she said. We'll take over from here, Greta said now. She said it twice, polite the first time, firm the second, and she reached for her phone to call me. But my phone was in a metal cabinet 40 minutes away, and the call went to voicemail. Denise stepped between Greta and the nursery doorway and said, the thing that family does when it wants to cause harm and call it love. Family takes care of family. Greta held her ground as long as she could. She was in someone else's home, outnumbered, with no way to reach me, and no idea when I'd be available. Margaret kept up that pleasant, immovable pressure that certain women have perfected over decades, the kind that doesn't shout, just leans, and keeps leaning until something gives. Eventually Greta left, rather than create a scene in front of a 10-week-old infant. She texted me the second her car reached the end of the block and she had signal. The last thing she told me later was the image that stayed with her. As she backed out of the driveway, she glanced up at the front window. Through the glass, she could see Margaret already dragging something heavy toward the door. What Margaret did next, she did believing she was rescuing her grandson. That is the part people find difficult to sit with. She did not see herself as the villain of this story. She saw herself as the hero arriving just in time. That made her far more dangerous than plain meanness ever could have been. She walked into Marcus's nursery, looked around, and decided it offended her. Too sparse. Too utilitarian. Looks like a supply room, she told anyone who would listen afterward. So she opened the can of primer she had thought to bring in the trunk of her car. Because yes, she had come with paint, and she started rolling gray over my son's walls, while he napped one room away. The fumes from fresh primer filled the house. That sharp chemical sweetness that settles in the back of your throat and refuses to leave. Denise called it clearing things out. Margaret called it making it livable. By noon, a neighbor named Caroline had drifted over, a friend of Margaret's from her women's group, who loved nothing more than a project centered on someone else's family. Carolyn had her phone out, filming in low, concerned tones about poor deployed Kevin and his little baby and the mother, who was never around. Margaret stood in the middle of the wet paint and the mess she was making and announced the room and to Caroline's camera, "No grandchild of mine is going to sleep in a room that looks like a barracks." Then she turned and looked at the crib, the one I had built on my hands and knees at midnight after Marcus came home from the hospital. The one with my mother's blanket folded over the rail. I wish I could tell you. She stopped there. She had barely started. She moved Marcus out of his crib and laid him down on the guest bed instead. On a large, soft adult mattress, propped between two bed pillows. In a room thick with primer fumes. With the door closed and a portable space heater running 3 feet from his face. Every single element of that arrangement is what a trained nurse would call an unsafe sleep environment. It is what I would call the longest 2 hours of my life. Hours I didn't even know were happening. Then she and Denise picked up the crib, carried it through the front door, down the walk, and shoved it into the garbage bin at the curb. The white slats were too tall to fit all the way, so they stuck up out of the top. They threw the safe sleep wedge in after it. They threw Marcus's little stuffed animals in after that. And they threw the wheat-colored blanket my mother had knitted in, too. The last thing her hands ever made, balled up and dropped on top of the pile like it was nothing. Carolyn filmed it. Denise laughed and Margaret, wiping primer from her palms with a rag, looked at the wreckage of my son's small world crammed into a trash bin and said the words, the ones a caseworker would repeat back to me before that day was finished. "No army brat is going to run my son's household." She was still smiling when the knock came at the door. None of them were expecting company, but it was 1:30 on a Saturday afternoon, and a home visit had been on my calendar for 2 weeks. The woman at the door was Ms. Vega, my new parent support nurse. Arriving for the wellness visit I had scheduled and had absolutely no reason to cancel. She was a composed, steady woman in her 50s, the kind who has seen everything at least once, and most things several times over. She didn't need to step inside to begin reading the precipitory situation. There was a crib in the garbage bin at the curb, white slats reaching toward the sky. There was the sharp smell of primer rolling out through the open door. And there was a stranger with paint on her hands, telling her there was no soldier home today and she was welcome to leave. Ms. Vega asked where the baby was. Margaret said he was sleeping, and it wasn't any of her business. Ms. Vega is a mandated reporter. The law does not give mandated reporters the option of deciding they didn't see what they saw. She told Margaret calmly that she had a legal obligation to report the conditions she was observing. Then she walked back to her car and made the call that started everything. I want to stop here for a moment, because this is the part that matters most. Do the boring, careful things even when nobody applauds them. Keep the plan updated. Keep the paperwork filed. If you are the person in your family or your friend group who overprepares while everyone else rolls their eyes and calls you anxious, this story is for you. If you've ever been told you're too rigid, too organized, too serious about the details, leave a comment that says, "I'd have called too," because the details are exactly what held everything up when it mattered. Let's keep going. At 11:30, the cabinet opened and our phones came back. Mine lit up the second it powered on and kept lighting up. Texts from Greta, stacked one on top of the other, each one worse than the one before it. They made me leave. "Renee, I'm so sorry, I tried." And then a photograph, taken fast through a windshield, blurry at the edges but unmistakable. My trash bin at the curb. For white slats reaching up out of it, I have spent 12 years training my hands to stay steady when everything else in me wants to shake. That training was the only reason the phone didn't hit the floor. My stomach went cold and hollow all at once, but my hands stayed flat and still. And something quiet in the back of my brain started doing what it has always done under pressure, making a list. Panic is a luxury I filed away for later. I walked, didn't run to my first sergeant and held the phone up so he could see the photo. I told him in plain language what I was looking at. He is a man who has watched a great many soldiers through a great many hard days, and his face did something I had never seen it do before. It went completely still. He looked at the picture. He looked at me. He didn't ask a single question I'd have to answer twice. Harmon, go. He was already reaching for his own phone. I'll make the calls. I didn't know yet what calls he meant. I knew I had 40 minutes of road between me and my son, and I drove every mile of it like the speed limit was a personal affront. Here is the system I had always known about in theory, but never had to trust in practice. When a report of an unsafe child comes in and that child belongs to a military family, the civilian side and the military side do not work in separate rooms. They coordinate. Child Protective Services contacts the installation's Family Advocacy Program. Family Advocacy notifies the soldier's commanding officer, law enforcement, and the medical team. And they move together, because a child's safety is not something anyone in that system is permitted to sit on. I knew all of this the way you know the rules of a card game you've never had to actually play on. The long flat stretch where the radio dies. I called Greta on speaker and had her walk me through every minute from the beginning. What time Margaret arrived. What she said when Greta wouldn't move. What Greta had seen through the window as she backed out of the driveway. I was not venting. I was building a timeline the same way I would build one for an after-action report. Because somewhere in my training, my brain had already decided that this was going to come down to who could tell the truth. In order, with dates attached. Greta kept apologizing. I kept telling her she had done exactly right, because she had. She had said no. She had tried to call me. She had left because the alternative was a screaming match in front of an infant. The failure was not hers, and it was not mine. It belonged entirely to a woman who had walked into my home and decided that love was the same thing as getting her own way. I came off the flat stretch, and the radio found a signal. And I had that particular sick feeling in my stomach that told me doors were already opening ahead of me that I hadn't knocked on yet. I turned onto our street, and there it was. Exactly like Greta's photo. Exactly like the image that has lived behind my eyes ever since. The green garbage bin at the curb. 4 white crib slats reaching up out of the top. I left my truck half in the driveway and went through my own front door, and the smell hit me before I could see anything. Primer thick and chemical, every window sealed shut against the cold outside. I found my son on the guest bed, between 2 pillows, beside a running space heater. In a room you could barely breathe in. I had him against my chest in under a second. I carried him straight to the living room, threw the windows open one-handed, killed the heater, and stood in the cold, clean air with his little breath against my neck. While my heart finally caught up with the rest of me, Margaret came out of the hallway with primer still on her hands and looked at me, like I was the one who didn't belong. "Well," she said, "you finally decided to act like his mother." I did not raise my voice. I have learned that the quietest thing in a room is usually the one people remember longest afterward. "Step back from him," I said. Now, she stepped back. I think the flatness of it startled her more than shouting would have. And then, on my way through the front door with Marcus safe against me, I looked into that trash bin one more time. And I saw it, a corner of wheat-colored wool, crumpled under the slats. My mother's blanket, in the garbage. That was the moment the cold steadiness inside me grew a spine. The first thing I did was not yell at Margaret. I'm proud of that. The first thing I did was put Marcus in his car seat and drive to the pediatric clinic, because the only opinion in that house I cared about belonged to a medical professional. They checked him completely. He was fine, warm and pink and fussy and perfect. No harm done. I have thanked God for those 3 words more times than I can count, because I know how easily it could have gone the other way. while they weighed him. I stood in the corner of the exam room and started writing. Times, names, what Greta had witnessed, what I had walked into. I saved her photograph in 3 separate places so it couldn't disappear. It wasn't strategy. It was instinct, the same instinct that keeps a soldier's gear squared away when everything around them is chaos. By the time we got home, Margaret and Denise had cleaned up the most visible evidence of what they'd done, as if a mopped floor could undo what had already been set in motion. My phone was full of messages. Denise, you left. Everyone saw. The kind of message that told me they thought this was about appearances, about who looked like the better mother on a Saturday afternoon. Then I saw that Caroline had posted her little video to the neighborhood community page, all concerned hedge, about poor deplored Kevin and his wife who was never home. The comments were already stacking up. I read 3 of them. I put my phone face down on the counter. Everyone saw, Denise had said. I sat down on the floor of my son's half-painted primary king nursery, and I thought very calmly, you have absolutely no idea what everyone is about to see. That night, after Marcus was finally asleep in a borrowed bassinet, a neighbor had dropped off. I sat at the kitchen table with every light in the house on. I spread everything out and looked at it in order. The family care plan, Greta's name, the approval stamp, Margaret's name, nowhere on any page. The new parent support enrollment with Ms. Vega's visit on the calendar. The pediatric clearance from that afternoon. The photo with its times. My drill orders showing exactly where I had been required to be, and exactly why I could not be reached. After a year of being told I was too rigid, too clinical, that I ran my household like a command briefing. That night, every careful thing I had ever done lined up in front of me like sandbags before a flood. I had spent a long time being quietly embarrassed by the binder. Sitting there at midnight, careful, felt like a life raft. I went through the tabs, and I found something I had only half freed when it came in. An email from Ms. Vega's office, sent at 1:48 that afternoon while I was at the clinic with Marcus. I opened it on my laptop. It was the report. Not a notification, not a courtesy heads up. The actual filed report, with a timestamp, a case number, and language I recognized from my own professional world. I sat very still and read it twice. And in my kitchen, under the hum of the refrigerator and my mother's recipe magnets, I understood that the wheels were not about to start turning. They had been turning since 1:40. They were already aimed somewhere. I read the final paragraph slowly, the way you read a map before you move, because the child belonged to an active duty military family. The matter had been referred to the installation's Family Advocacy Program. Family Advocacy would, per standard procedure, notify the service member's commanding officer. The service member's commanding officer, mine, not Kevin's. He was the deployed spouse on the other side of the world. Mine, the captain who knew my name, had signed my last evaluation, and was about to receive a report about conditions at my home address. I sat with that for a long time. And then I noticed something I almost smiled at. Despite everything, the machine Margaret thought she had aimed at me was a machine I had been living inside correctly for 12 years. The file it was building was my file. Clean, documented. 11 years of doing exactly what I was supposed to do. Exactly when I was supposed to do it. The system she thought she had called down on the army brat was a system built on records. And I had the records. Margaret's words came back to me. No army brat is going to run my son's household. I said it out loud to the empty kitchen. Then I said the thing I would say to her face soon enough. It was never his household, Margaret. It's our home. My phone buzzed against the table. I turned it over. Captain Morris. On a Saturday night, I answered, and his voice was level and deliberate. Sergeant Harmon, I need to walk you through what's coming to your door tomorrow. Captain Morris did not use words unnecessarily, which is one of the reasons I would have followed him without hesitation. He told me a caseworker from Child Protective Services would be coming Monday morning to conduct an assessment. Because that is what happens when a report is filed. It gets worked. Every time, no exceptions. He told me that because we were a military family, the installation's family advocacy team was already coordinating, and that he would be present himself, in person, representing the command, because that is the protocol when one of his soldiers is involved. Then he told me what I needed to hear and what I needed to be warned about in the same breath. Your record speaks for you, he said. Let it speak. Don't argue. Don't perform. Put the truth and the paperwork on the table and step back and let people read it. He made it clear that my rank was not going to determine the outcome. The conditions would be assessed on their face, by the caseworker, on the merits. Cleared or not cleared would come down to facts alone. I told him I understood. I did. I wasn't being handed a win. I was being told to get out of the truth's way and trust it to do its own work. After we hung up, I sat in the dark for a while, somewhere across town. Margaret was no doubt telling Denise and Caroline that she'd handled it, that she'd reported the unfit mother, that the authorities were finally going to see what she had seen all along. Thought she was the one who had called the system down. She had no idea that the system was already standing behind me, and she was about to find out exactly which way it was facing. Margaret came by Sunday morning, uninvited. The way she did everything, she had dressed up. She wanted to smooth things over, which in her language meant she wanted me to agree that none of this would travel any further. For the good of the family name, she stood in my half-painted living room and told me, a mother always knows what's best. And then, for one strange and unguarded minute, the whole front she carried slipped, and I saw the actual woman underneath. She talked about the years she had raised Kevin alone, about pacing the floor at 2 a.m. with a colicky baby, while her husband was stationed somewhere she couldn't even find on a map, about the specific loneliness of loving someone who belongs, in part, to an institution that doesn't ask your permission before it takes them away. Her voice cracked, and for that minute, I felt something real for her, because I knew that loneliness from the inside now. I was living it. But then she dried her eyes. Her jaw set, and she put it all back on me. I kept the army from having my son, she said. Now it has you, and it's trying to take my grandson. That was the moment I stopped feeling sorry for her. Grief is real. Her grief was real. But she had chosen to turn it into a weapon and aim it at a 10-week-old's crib. That choice was hers alone. Would be its own kind of. And then she said something that showed me just how completely she had the situation inverted. I already told the caseworker everything, she said, almost smug about it. They'll understand when they see the full picture. She thought she was the complainant. She thought when the caseworker arrived Monday morning, she would be the responsible grandmother, presenting her evidence against the negligent mother. I didn't correct her. Some understandings have to be arrived at in person. I simply said, I'm sure they'll see everything. And I showed her to the door by Sunday afternoon. Caroline's video had traveled. It had jumped from the neighborhood page into a handful of group chats. And a collection of people who had never met me had developed strong opinions about what kind of mother I was. 2 of them messaged me directly, all concern, no questions. Denise sent me a series of messages that boiled down to a single idea. Everyone's on our side. Just apologize and make this quiet. The 18-year-old who had enlisted because her hometown was forgetting her name would have fired back. Would have been up until 2 a.m. typing and deleting and typing again. The soldier I had become did something harder. Nothing. I did not post a single word in my own defense. I did not argue with strangers about my son. Instead, I gathered everything. The timeline, Greta's photo, the binder, the clinic visit, and I submitted it through the proper channel to the caseworker's office. And I asked Greta if she would be willing to be present in person to say what she had witnessed. She said yes before I finished asking. That is the entire difference. And it took me years to learn it. They fight with noise. I answer with records. I don't argue with rumors. I answer with paperwork. The loud people can be as loud as they want. The quiet truth was sitting in a binder on my kitchen table. Dated on every page, it wasn't going anywhere that night. I laid Marcus down in the borrowed bassinet and folded the wheat-colored blanket, washed clean again, up around him. I sat beside him in the dark and listened to him breathe. And for the first time since I'd turned onto our street and seen those 4 white slats in the garbage, I felt something close to steady. They were coming tomorrow. I was ready for them to come. I want to be honest about Monday morning, because pretending I wasn't frightened would be its own kind of lie. I knew what was at stake. An assessment can clear you, but it can also open a longer investigation. And a longer investigation touches everything. Custody arrangements, your military career, your security clearance, your name on a base where everyone knows everyone. If my paperwork had been incomplete, if one account had blurred into another, if a single date had been off, I would have been looking at months of proving I was not what a neighbor's video implied. So I did the only thing I know how to do under pressure. I prepared. I went through the binder one final time. Tab by tab, the way you check a weapon before you trust your life to it. Greta arrived early, in her good blouse, nervous and ready, and absolutely fierce. I went room to room and opened every window I could reach, letting the cold morning air push the last of the primer smell out through the back of the house. I needed them to walk in and breathe clean air. I couldn't stand the thought of anyone crossing my threshold and smelling what Margaret had done to it. I made coffee. Nobody drank it. I held Marcus and watched the street dot at 10 on the dot. A plain sedan turned the corner and slowed in front of the house. And behind it, a second car, government plates, the kind I recognized on sight. My pulse went up. My hands stayed flat and still. 3 hours after that nurse had knocked on my door Saturday afternoon, she had done her part. Now, 2 days later, the rest of it was pulling up to my curb. The doorbell rang. The caseworker introduced herself as Ms. Reyes. She was exactly what you'd want in a situation like this and exactly what you'd fear: calm, precise, and completely neutral. A woman whose entire job is to not take anyone's word for anything. She had a folder of her own before I could say a single word. Margaret swept in from where she had been waiting on the porch, because of course she had come, and launched into her account like she'd been rehearsing it since Saturday night. "Thank goodness you're here," she told Ms. Reyes. "I'm the only stable adult this baby has had around him." She talked about the absent mother who ran off to play soldier. She gestured at the half-painted walls she herself had painted as evidence of my neglect. She talked about the state of the house, and the baby left with strangers, and the poor deployed husband, who had no idea what his wife was really like. Denise stood at her shoulder and nodded along. Out on the front lawn, Caroline had her phone up again, filming what she clearly believed was going to be the grandmother's vindication. I stood there holding Marcus, and I said almost nothing, which was the hardest thing I had done all weekend. Every instinct I have was screaming at me to defend myself, to correct every false thing coming out of Margaret's mouth point by point. Captain Morris's voice was in my head. "Don't perform. Let it speak." So I let Margaret build the whole structure of her story, brick by careful brick, right up to the very top. The responsible grandmother, the reckless absent mother, until she was standing proud at the peak of it to Ms. Reyes. "Listened," she wrote. Her face gave away absolutely nothing. Then she turned to me, pen ready, and asked me to walk her through my side. And for the first time since I had turned onto our street 2 days ago, I got to open my mouth. I didn't raise my voice. I reached for the binder. I didn't tell Ms. Reyes' story. I handed her one she could read for herself. The family care plan first, Greta's name, the approval, the date, signed by the appropriate parties. Margaret's name nowhere on any page. The new parent support enrollment, with Ms. Viga's Saturday appointment on the calendar. The pediatric clearance from Saturday afternoon showing a healthy baby. Greta's photograph, time-stamped. My drill orders proving exactly where I had been and exactly why. I could not be reached by phone. I set each one down in front of her, one at a time. "I didn't leave him with no one," I said, keeping my voice as flat and level as I could manage. "I left him with an approved plan." She threw the plan away. Ms. Reyes paged through the documents. She is not a woman who skims. She compared the family care plan to what Margaret had just described, and I watched the temperature in the room shift without anyone touching the thermostat. Margaret's smile began to loosen at the corners. Denise went quiet. Greta spoke when Ms. Reyes asked her to, steady and plain. No drama, and described arriving at the door to find 2 women she didn't know who told her she was no longer needed, that she had been dismissed over her objection, that she had attempted to reach me and could not, and that the last thing she had seen through the window as she pulled away was Margaret dragging the crib toward the front door. Ms. Reyes wrote it all down carefully. Then she looked up from the binder and directed her gaze. Not at me, but at Margaret. Mrs. Merritt, she said, in that precise, neutral tone that is somehow more unnerving than any raised voice. You dismissed the approved caregiver, and you turned away the home visit nurse. Is that correct? On the record, the silence in my living room had a texture to it. Margaret opened her mouth. For the first time in as long as I had known her, nothing useful came out. Ms. Reyes had already spoken with Ms. Vega directly. That is how this work is done. You don't file a report and wait. You build it out. With Margaret standing right there in my living room, Ms. Reyes confirmed the nurse's account detail by detail, and each point landed the way a brick lands when it comes off a roof. The crib observed in the trash bin at the curb. The smell of fresh primer through the open door. The infant placed to sleep on an adult bed in a sealed room, beside a running portable heater. A stranger telling the arriving nurse that there was no soldier home today and she could leave. Ms. Vega's report, and Greta's photograph and my drill orders all told the same story. With the same times, down to the minute. Margaret's version was the only account that didn't fit. She tried to cut in, "This is a family matter, not some," and Ms. Reyes lifted one hand, not unkindly, and the sentence evaporated. I watched the realization move across Margaret's face in stages, slow and thorough, rearranging everything she thought she knew about how this morning was going to go. She had not summoned the authorities to investigate me. The authorities were here because of what she had done. She was not the complainant in this. She was the subject of the report. Denise saw it too. I watched Kevin's sister begin the quiet arithmetic of someone deciding which side of a sinking ship to stand on. Out on the lawn, Caroline had lowered her phone. Nobody was performing anymore. And then, in the middle of that heavy silence, I heard a car door close outside, firm and deliberate. The sound of someone who has been trained to do everything with precision, including shut a door. I looked through the open front window. There was still one element Margaret had not accounted for, and it was walking up my front path in dress uniform. The car was a government sedan, the kind I knew on sight. The man stepping out of it wore his Army service uniform pressed to a knife's edge, with a family advocacy liaison walking a step behind him. To anyone who didn't know the situation, it looked like the military, arriving to investigate the negligent mother. Margaret did not know the situation. I watched her spine straighten. I watched the hope come back into her eyes, and she actually smiled. "See," she said to Ms. Reyes, to Denise, to the room, and there was genuine triumph in it. "See, even the Army could see something was wrong here." Carolyn raised her phone again. Sensing a finale, Denise edged back toward her mother. Hope being the contagious thing it is, and I stood in the middle of my own living room. My son asleep against my chest, my mother's blanket tucked around him, and I said nothing, because I already knew what they didn't. I knew the uniform. I knew the rank. I knew before he reached the front steps exactly whose command I fell under, and exactly why he had come in person on a Monday morning. Margaret kept narrating her own victory through the screen door, telling the officer that she was the grandmother, the one who had been holding this family together, the one who had finally done something about it. The liaison opened the door. Captain Morris stepped inside. He took the room in with one clean sweep, the open binder on the table, the caseworker, the half-painted walls. The woman with primer still worked into her cuticles. And then he found me. He stopped. He came to attention in the center of my living room. And then every single person in that house learned who I actually was. All at once he raised his hand in a salute, crisp as a flag in a clean wind, and said it loud enough for the whole room and the open window and Carolyn's phone to hear. Sergeant Harmon. "Captain Morris, are you all right?" I shifted Marcus to my left arm and returned it because some things are reflex no matter what you're holding. "Sir," I said. That was all. You could have heard the house breathe. Margaret's face came apart in stages. First, confusion, like the sentence hadn't assembled correctly. Then, a kind of reaching, her eyes moving from Captain Morris to me and back, looking for the mistake, the explanation, the version of this that made sense with the story she'd been telling. And then, in a voice that had gone thin and completely stripped of its earlier certainty, "Why is he saluting you?" Nobody answered right away. There was nothing that needed saying. that army brat she had been sneering at for 2 years. The runaway mother who had abandoned her baby to play soldier. She was standing there in full view, an 11-year non-commissioned officer, her own son's wife. Calm in her own home with her child safe in her arms, Captain Morris lowered his hand and turned to Ms. Reyes. All business. As though he hadn't just reorganized everything in the room with a single gesture. I'm here as Sergeant Harmon's commanding officer, representing the Family Advocacy Program, he said. I'll tell you plainly, her record is one of the cleanest on the installation. Margaret made a small sound. The sound of a story collapsing that you've told so many times you'd started to believe it, yourself. There was a version of that moment I had imagined the night before. Lying awake beside the bassinet. A version where I'd stood in front of Ms. Reyes and Captain Morris and Carolyn's camera and Denise's stunned face, and I made Margaret account for every single cruel thing she had ever said about me. Publicly, with witnesses. One careful sentence at a time. I had earned that version. Nobody in that room would have questioned me for taking it, but I have learned slowly, and not without cost, that the loudest revenge is almost always the cheapest, and it leaves you holding less than you started with. When Ms. Reyes asked me what outcome I was seeking, I kept my voice as steady as I'd kept it all morning. I said my son's safety came first and last. I said I wanted Margaret removed from every caregiver plan, every authorized contact list, every document that touched Marcus's life. I said I wanted the full account on record, in order with dates, in a place where it could not be balled up and thrown in a trash bin, and then I said the thing that surprised even me as it came out. I don't need her punished, I said. I need her name off my son's life. Captain Morris gave a small nod. The kind that means something has been understood and will be done. Miss Reyes wrote it down. Margaret stared at me like I had spoken a language she didn't recognize. Because in her world, winning means the heel on the throat, and she could not process a woman who had won and chosen not to use it that way. I wasn't being generous. I was being free, standing there with Marcus's heartbeat against mine. I finally understood the difference between the two. That was when Margaret came apart, and it was loud. All the pressure she had held behind that pleasant, composed, immovable exterior for years, came apart sideways. The way it always does when the script stops working and the world refuses to behave the way someone has decided it should. She turned on Captain Morris and demanded to know who he thought he was. She turned on Miss Reyes and called the whole proceeding a setup, an institution protecting one of its own. She turned on Greta and called her a liar. She invoked the family name like a password that had stopped working overnight, and she got louder with every sentence as the ground gave way beneath her dot. And here is the thing I want you to hold on to, because it is the whole secret of how you win something like this without ever throwing a single punch. She was screaming. I was quiet. The grandmother who had spent 2 years lecturing me about dignity was coming apart in my living room, and the army brat she had thrown out with the trash was standing perfectly still, holding her grandson, saying absolutely nothing at all. Denise had stopped nodding. She had taken one full step away from her mother and was studying her shoes. The unmistakable posture of someone beginning to privately rewrite their own role in events. Out on the lawn, Caroline had slid her phone quietly into her jacket pocket, because the only footage worth capturing now was footage. She very much did not want to exist. The power in that room had transferred completely, and not a decibel of it had come from me. Then my phone buzzed against the table twice, hard. I glanced down a video call. The little icon spinning from a number routed halfway around the world. Kevin, his face filled the screen, and the first words out of his mouth were, "Mom did what?" I turned the phone so he could see the room. His mother read, the caseworker, the captain, the half-painted walls. Marcus, asleep through all of it against my shoulder. Kevin had gotten 10 minutes of signal between assignments. His first sergeant had told him enough to make him go looking for a connection. For a moment, the whole house went still to listen, because some part of Margaret still believed her son would choose her side. He did not. Mom. His voice came through the small speaker, tired and final. You will not be alone with them again until you've completed every class they require. And you are leaving Renee's house today. She said his name like a question, like a plea. He didn't answer it. He looked at me through the screen. I've got you, he said. Finish it. The call dropped back into the dark. The room exhaled. Ms. Reyes closed her folder and laid out where things stood. Plainly enough for everyone present to understand, the approved caregiver had been dismissed by someone with no authority to do so. The unsafe sleep conditions had been created by Margaret. The nurse's report, the photograph, the drill orders, and the clinic clearance all agreed with each other, and agreed with Greta's account. As for the concern that had appeared in the original report, the concern about the mother, it was unsubstantiated. The file would reflect that the danger had originated with a different adult entirely. Margaret started to speak, and I finally turned to face her directly for the first time all morning. I said the only thing I'd been keeping since Saturday, soft, certain. The way you set down something heavy, you've carried too far past where you should have put it down. Said no army brat was going to run your son's household. I let it sit there for a moment, with Marcus breathing slowly against my collarbone. This was never his household, Margaret. It's our home. And now, that's all on the record. She had no answer. For the first time since I had known her, Margaret Merritt had absolutely nothing left to say. The outcome was quiet and precise, which is the only kind I've ever trusted. Ms. Reyes documented that the report against me was unsubstantiated, that my family care plan had been valid and correctly followed, and that the conditions requiring investigation were attributable to Margaret's conduct in the home. Margaret was removed from every authorized contact list and barred from unsupervised visits with Marcus until she had completed the full required family advocacy curriculum. Classes she would attend on her own time, in a room full of strangers, learning things she had been completely certain she already knew. No one was arrested. No one was hurt. I never raised my voice, my hand, or a lawyer. I simply put the truth on a table with a date on every page, and let the right people read it. That is the whole of it. And it is not really a trick at all. Caroline's video did the remaining work on its own. Once the neighborhood understood what had actually happened, who had thrown a newborn's crib in the trash, and who had been on lawful duty, the comments turned. Caroline took the video down before noon and developed a sudden commitment to minding her own affairs. Denise sent me a long, careful message about how she had never been truly comfortable with any of it, which we both knew to be revisionist history. And I let her keep it, because peace sometimes means letting people quietly rewrite their own small parts. As Margaret gathered her things to leave my home, she paused in the doorway, searching for a final foothold. I didn't offer one. You kept saying family, I told her, steady as Sunday. Going forward, the family that handles my son is the one on the plan, with his name on it. In writing, she left without the smile she had arrived with. I watched her car turn off the street. Then I went and straightened one of my mother's recipe magnets on the fridge, because something in me needed to put at least one small thing back where it belonged. When everyone had gone, the house was quiet in the way I had been chasing all weekend. The good kind. The kind that means something is actually finished. I went out to the curb in the last of the afternoon light, and pulled Marcus's crib out of the trash bin myself. Slat by white slat. Some of it was scuffed. One rail had a crack in it. I decided right there I would order a new one in the morning. But I was not going to leave my son's bed sitting in a garbage bin 1 minute longer than it had to. I carried it back up the walk. I brought it inside. Then I went through the house and opened every window again, even though the evening was cold, and let the air move through from front to back, until the smell of primer was completely gone, and all that was left was cold evening and clean laundry. The walls were still half gray. I'd paint them back myself, my color, on my schedule. I fed Marcus. I wrapped him in the wheat-colored blanket, washed soft again, the last thing my mother's hands had ever made, and I talked to him quietly in the dark. The way you talk to someone who can't understand your words yet, but hears the shape of them. I told him about her. I told him she would have liked him. I told him she made things built to last. And sitting there in the quiet I had worked so hard to get back, I understood something about myself that I had spent years being mildly embarrassed by. All that careful, all those binders and tabs and dated pages that everyone around me called excessive. It was never anxiety. It was never rigidity. Careful was love written down in a form no one could ball up and throw away. My mother had knitted a blanket so her hands would always be around her grandson. I had built a system so the truth would always have somewhere to stand. Same instinct. Different yarn. I held Marcus until he was asleep, and for the first time in 3 days, I slept too. I want to be clear about the boundary I eventually set, because people get boundaries wrong in both directions. I did not cut Margaret off permanently and declare some kind of permanent verdict, because Marcus might someday want to know his grandmother as something more than a lesson in what not to do. But I did not pretend the weekend had not happened, either, because pretending is how you teach someone that what they did was acceptable. In a short written message, where there could be no later confusion about what had been said, I told her this: if she wanted to be part of Marcus's life, it would be supervised. After she had completed every class the program required, there would be no more unannounced visits. Every caregiver in his life would go through the plan on paper, approved in writing, the way the rules I happen to live by already require. The door isn't locked, I told her. And I meant it. But from now on, I'm the one holding the key. She didn't respond for a long time. When she finally did, it was 4 words, not an apology exactly, but closer than I had ever expected from her. I signed up Monday. I read it twice, sitting at the kitchen table with the binder closed for once, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for 2 full years. Not forgiveness yet. Not quite. But the first cold morning of a maybe. And maybe it was more than she had ever offered me before. The weeks after were calmer than I had any right to expect. Kevin came home on emergency leave, a little sooner than planned, and the first thing he did was put the new crib together in the nursery by the morning window while I sat nearby and pretended to supervise. He had a longer conversation with his mother than I was part of, and I didn't ask for the details. Some things are between a son and the woman who raised him, and I had learned the hard way that you cannot do that work for anyone else. Margaret attended the classes. From what I heard, she did not enjoy being a student at 62. Sitting in a circle with young parents, learning the fundamentals of keeping an infant safe. Good. Some lessons are meant to be uncomfortable. Denise kept her distance, which suited me. Caroline found a new project somewhere I wasn't involved in. And me, I kept the binder. Of course I did. Only now there was a new tab near the front, with a case number and a single closed report that said, in the flat and factual language of people who deal exclusively in documented truth, that the mother had done nothing wrong. I will keep that page for the rest of my life. Not because I need it anymore, but because there were 2 years when I would have given anything to be believed. And now I am holding the proof, dated and signed, in a form that no one can crumple up and throw in a trash bin. Marcus sleeps in his new crib under his great-grandmother's blanket. He sleeps fine. They were so certain that being a soldier made me less of a mother. It turned out it made me exactly the kind of mother who keeps the receipts, holds the line, and keeps her child safe while everyone around her is busy with the performance. That is my story. 1 trash bin, 1 nurse who knocked at exactly the right hour, and a single word sergeant that my mother-in-law never once saw coming. If tonight reminded you that quiet preparation is its own kind of courage, then update your own plan. Whatever your version of it is, write it down, date it, keep it somewhere it can be found. And if there is a woman in your life who is the careful one everyone underestimates, send this to her. She'll understand every word. Drop a comment, subscribe to her side of the story. For every woman who held it together alone, I'll see you in the next one. Together.